I was reading this story a few nights ago, and I kept stopping at the same moment. Not the investigation, not the board meeting, not even the ending. The moment I kept returning to is the afternoon Elise writes the credentials on a sticky note and hands it over without hesitation. She doesn't pause. She doesn't second guess. That ease is the entire architecture of what follows. The antiseptic smell reached me first. Then the fluorescent hum, low and constant, the kind that burrows into the back of your skull after a few hours and becomes indistinguishable from your own headache. I knew without opening my eyes that I was in a hospital. I knew with a cold certainty that had nothing to do with medical charts or the shape of the ceiling or the sound of soft shoes on linoleum exactly which hospital it was. Wyndham General, Wing C Room 7, the same water-stained tile in the upper left corner of the ceiling, brownish oval, the size of a dinner plate. I had stared at that tile for 2 days last time. I opened my eyes and looked at it again, so here we were. I lay still and catalogued carefully. Left wrist in a soft brace. The fracture, same as before, hairline, non-surgical. Shed headache that was distant and muffled in the way that means medication is involved, but wearing thin. The smell of lavender from the diffuser the night shift nurse kept at her station. Her name was Patricia. She had a daughter who played rec soccer on Saturday mornings, and a laugh that started in her chest before it reached her face. She would come in at 11 to check the IV line and ask if I was cold, and she would have the blanket from the cabinet already in her arm when she asked. I lay in the fluorescent quiet and let myself understand what had happened. 3 years. I had lived 3 years past this morning, and then I had not. And now I was here again, in the same room, with the same ceiling tile and the same fracture in my left wrist. And every memory of every day of those 3 years sitting in my chest like a complete and organized file. I did not feel shocked. That surprised me, slightly. I had expected something more dramatic from the experience of being returned to your own life. What I felt instead was a specific and immediate clarity. The kind that strips everything non-essential and leaves only the thing that matters. I was not going to lose the Caldwell work. I was not going to lose my credentials. I was not going to spend the last 8 months of those 3 years applying for positions I was no longer qualified for on paper, watching my name disappear from work I had produced, watching someone else settle into my office and speak at conferences about my methodology in first person. I had done that once. I was not doing it again. The door opened. Saw Patricia came in, saw my eyes open, and gave me that slightly too bright smile that nurses use when they are relieved. "Dr. Voss, good to see you back with us." "Thank you," I said. My voice was rough. "How long?" "About 14 hours since they brought you in. The doctor will be around in the morning. You should try to rest." I nodded and let her check my vitals and adjust something on the IV stand. She asked if I was cold. I said a little. She brought the blanket from the cabinet without being asked. When she left, I closed my eyes and lay in the quiet and thought. I had approximately 3 years before Arabella submitted the stolen research methodology to Wyndham Institute's board of directors and changed both our lives irrevocably. Last time, I hadn't known it was coming. This time, I had nothing but time. The thing about the car accident, the thing I hadn't fully understood the first time around, was that it had cleared 2 weeks from my schedule at a moment I would normally have spent them at my desk. I'd been frustrated by it then, anxious to get back. Worried about the backlog, the Caldwell timeline, the email from Dorian about the November board cycle. Now I understood the accident as a gift. 2 weeks in which no one expected anything from me. 2 weeks in which I could think without performing the act of thinking. 2 weeks in which I could build the foundation of what I needed to build before I walked back into that building and resumed being, as far as anyone could tell, exactly the researcher I had been. I spent the first 3 days in the hospital doing very little visibly. I asked for a notepad and a pen and told Patricia I was working on a paper. Partially true. What I was actually writing was a timeline, not the timeline of the car accident or my recovery. The timeline of what had happened to me in the previous version of the next 3 years. I needed to have it on paper. Not because I would forget it. The memory was complete and vivid in a way that didn't feel like it would fade, but because writing it in sequence forced me to see the architecture of it. The order in which things had been set in motion. Who had moved first? what each move had been intended to accomplish. Arabella had moved first. This was the thing I had gotten wrong, the first time. I had assumed Dorian was the primary actor, and she was the beneficiary of his machinations. But writing it out, in sequence, I understood that she had moved first and he had followed. He had been strategic in his support, surgical in his protection of her position, but he had not designed the plan. She had. She had seen the Caldwell project clearly from its earliest phase. She had understood, before I did, what it would become. She had spent a year building proximity to it through the natural coverage of our friendship, our lunches, our collaborative professional conversations, in which I had talked about my work freely, openly, with the trust of someone who does not yet understand that trust can be a form of research. The lunch conversations had been primary data collection. I wrote that on the notepad and stared at it for a while. The sticky note with my Meridian credentials had not been the beginning. It had been the harvest, right at the end of a very long growing season. By the time she asked for my login, she already knew the methodology completely. She'd absorbed it over 14 months of careful listening. The database access gave her the files she needed to submit it convincingly, the technical architecture, the statistical frameworks, the supporting datasets. But the intellectual understanding had come from me, delivered voluntarily, over Italian food. That was the part that had felt, the first time, like my own failure, like I had been somehow complicit in my own undoing. I had thought about that differently over time. The version of me in the hospital room with the notepad thought about it differently still. The mistake had not been trusting Arabella. Friendship is not a mistake. The mistake had been trusting her without building a record that would protect the work regardless of what she chose to do. The work needed to be able to stand on its own, in a room where I wasn't present. I turned to a clean page and began writing the second timeline. The one that was going to happen differently. On the third day, Margaret came. She was exactly as I remembered. Silver hair cut close to her skull, the particular posture of a woman who has spent 40 years in rooms where she needed to take up a certain amount of space deliberately. She sat in the chair beside the hospital bed and did not offer pleasantries, and did not ask me how I was feeling in a voice that expected an answer about my feelings. "You look better than the photos," she said. "Dorian sent you photos?" "He forwarded them to the department." She paused. "He's been asking about your return timeline." "Tell him 2 weeks," I said, "and tell him I'd like the Meridian access logs from the summer archived before I get back. IT can handle it." Margaret looked at me with the particular expression she used when someone said something that didn't fit the expected register of a conversation. "That's specific?" "I think clearly on painkillers," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The Caldwell project. How far along are you, actually?" "Far enough that I'm nervous about it," I said. "Which is when I know it's worth protecting." She tapped the arm of the chair once. Not the table. There was no table. But the gesture was the same. A single, deliberate tap that meant she was filing something. "I'll pass along the IT request," she said. She stayed for 40 minutes. We talked about the fall research cycle and a paper she was finishing on cohort design, and her grandson who had apparently become very interested in insects, to his parents' mixed feelings. When she left, she squeezed my good wrist once, a small, uncharacteristic gesture from a woman not given to physical warmth, and then left without looking back. I sat with that gesture for a while after she was gone. In my first life, I had never told Margaret what I knew was coming. I had tried to manage it alone, and then when it was already too late, I had come to her and found that her hands were largely tied by institutional structure. Dorian outranked her in the research division. The complaint process ran through channels he controlled. She had done what she could, but what she could do at that stage had not been enough. This time, I was not going to need her to fight, but I was going to need her to know. Not now, not all of it. But gradually, over the coming months, I was going to let her understand the shape of what I was doing without ever giving her specific information that could compromise her position. She would be a witness, not a combatant. I needed her eyes open. I was discharged on a Thursday. I went home to my apartment, which was exactly as I'd left it. The particular archaeology of a working researcher's home, books in stacks that had logic to them if you understood the logic, A whiteboard in the hallway that I used for methodology diagrams. The diagram currently on the whiteboard was from 2 months before the accident, phase 1 of the Caldwell framework in an early iteration. I stood in front of it for a long time. It was incomplete. Said in the way that early-stage work is incomplete, you could see the structure that was trying to emerge. And I knew, having already completed it once, exactly what it was trying to become. I knew every decision point, every revision, every wrong turn that took 2 weeks to identify as wrong. I picked up the marker and crossed out a section in the middle that I already knew was the wrong approach to the statistical framework. Then I stared at the white space I'd created and thought, I didn't fill it in, not yet. I wanted to arrive at it correctly, even the second time. Something about the quality of the work mattered to me in a way that couldn't be reduced to the outcome. I had lived through what it felt like to have the work exist only as documentation, stripped of its origin. I was not going to make it again as a performance. Well, I was going to make it as itself. I put the marker down and went to make tea. The 2 weeks of recovery had a particular texture to them. On the surface, they were quiet. I went to Margaret's for tea twice. I spoke to the department secretary about my return schedule. I had a brief call with Dorian. Brief, purposeful, the practiced warmth of a man who manages everyone as a professional category, in which I confirmed my return date and asked about the fall briefing schedule. Below the surface, I was building. The first structure I needed was the enhanced access logging on my Meridian account. I knew Gideon Ferris would be my path to this, and I knew from the first timeline that he was reachable if you approached the conversation correctly. Oh, he was not someone who responded well to institutional alarm. The IT security division spent too much of its time managing researchers who treated system security as an inconvenience and came to him only when something had already gone wrong. But he responded well to specificity and to researchers who'd read the documentation. I spent an afternoon reading the Wyndham Institute's data governance policy, all 83 pages. I had skimmed it before, first time around, the way you skim policies you don't expect to need in any specific way. This time, I read it with the attention of someone looking for a mechanism. The enhanced logging protocol was there in Section 9. A voluntary opt-in for account holders who had concerns about unauthorized access. Explicitly permissible under the policy. Preserving records to institutional archive standards. 7 years. I folded the page corner down and went back to work. I returned to Wyndham on a Monday. The building smelled of coffee and old carpet and a faint chemical trace from the research labs on the first floor. The combination was specific enough to feel like a physical greeting. I had spent 7 years in this building. I knew the acoustics of each stairwell, the particular timing of the 4th floor elevator, the fact that the western kitchen had better light and the eastern one had a better coffee machine. Arabella was waiting by the elevator. I had expected this. She had done the same thing last time. The timing was too precise to be coincidence, which I'd noticed in retrospect and not at the time. She'd been watching the door. She came forward and embraced me. Oy, and her perfume was the same cedar, and something that I had always found pleasant, and now found significant in a purely evidential way. The kind of detail that tells you you're dealing with someone who manages impressions carefully down to the olfactory. Elise. She held my arms briefly and looked at me. You look so well. Thank you, I said. I kept the card from the flowers. I wasn't sure what to send. She fell into step beside me without being asked, which was also what she'd done before. There's so much to discuss. We should get lunch this week. Let's do Thursday, I said. The Italian place? She smiled. Perfect. I went to my office and shut the door quietly. I sat at my desk and looked at the courtyard through the window, the September courtyard, still holding on to late summer, in the way that this particular part of the country does, the trees not yet showing any color in their edges. And I thought about what it meant to be back here with 3 years of subsequent information and a plan. It felt very different from how I had expected it to feel. I had anticipated something more tightly wound, more vigilant. What I actually felt was a kind of calm that I could only describe as the specific opposite of powerlessness. I had been powerless before because I had not understood the rules of the territory I was moving through. I understood them now. I opened my computer and drafted an email to Gideon Ferris, requesting a meeting at his earliest convenience. His reply came within the hour. He had a slot the following Tuesday. Huma and I spent the rest of the afternoon going through the accumulated 2-week email backlog and responding to everything in the order of its institutional importance. Dorian's email was third in the queue, a detailed and warmly worded request for a preliminary update on the Caldwell timeline, framed as collegial interest, which it was not. I wrote back with 3 paragraphs of genuine progress notes, detailed enough to be useful, and said I was looking forward to the November briefing. Dorian, I should explain in more detail than I gave him before, because understanding him correctly was critical to everything that followed. He was 44 years old, which made him 9 years older than me, and he had been director of clinical research for 5 years. Oh, he was good at the job in the ways that matter institutionally, good at managing budgets and timelines and external partnerships, good at representing the division to the board, good at the specific political language that higher-level institutional meetings require. He was also genuinely, intellectually sharp. He understood the Caldwell methodology well enough to recognize its value before the board did, which was why he'd attached himself to it. What he lacked, what I had not seen clearly enough the first time because I had been watching him as a potential romantic figure, and that kind of watching distorts everything, was any particular attachment to how outcomes were produced. He cared about outcomes. He cared about credit and position and the correct distribution of resources in his direction. Notice the mechanism by which these things were achieved was not, for him, a matter of ethics. It was a matter of exposure. He had backed Arabella's play because he believed it would succeed cleanly. He had calculated the risk and found it acceptable. What he had not adequately accounted for, what neither of them had adequately accounted for, was that I had made the record ambiguous by accident the first time, and that this had been the actual load-bearing element of their strategy. An ambiguous record was what made it all possible. Remove the ambiguity, and the strategy collapsed. I was removing the ambiguity. Gideon Ferris had an office in the basement that was, as I'd remembered, considerably more comfortable than its location suggested. He was a methodical man in his early 50s who moved carefully and thought about things for slightly longer than the average institutional employee before speaking, which I had always liked. He asked me to sit down, which I did, and looked at me with the expression of a man who had been in this building long enough to have heard most categories of security concern and was cataloging which one this was. I told him I was concerned about potential unauthorized access to my Meridian account in the coming months, that I had reason to believe someone might request my credentials, not steal them, but request them, and that I intended to provide them when asked because declining would be conspicuous, and because I wanted to capture what happened next. He was quiet for longer than usual after that. "You're asking for enhanced logging," he said. "Oh, yes. I want to understand exactly what the enhanced log captures before I file the formal request." He went through it carefully. Standard logging, timestamps, session duration, files opened, enhanced logging, IP address, machine identifier, keystroke metadata, bulk download flags. The enhanced log tied originating machine to every access event, regardless of whose credentials were used. It was automatically archived at 7-year institutional retention. "If another person accesses my account from their machine," I said, "enhanced logging captures their machine identifier independently of my credentials." "Correct. And that log would be admissible in an institutional review." He paused again. "Under the data governance policy, yes. It meets the evidential standard for a formal complaint." "Good," I said. I'd like to file the request today." He looked at me for a moment, not suspiciously, but with something I can only describe as professional assessment. Then he pulled up the form. I signed it. He submitted it. By that evening, my Meridian account was generating enhanced logs. The trap had a floor. Now I needed walls. That was Prosper's part. His full name was Prosper Oswin, which I'd always thought was a name that would be more at home in a 19th century novel than in a computational methods office at a research institute, but he carried it with equanimity. He was 4 years past his doctorate, worked in a corner of the building that most researchers visited only when they had data structure problems, and was in possession of a skill set that was more forensic than most people in his division were aware of. Oh, he owed me a favor from a paper we'd co-authored 3 years before the accident. I had insisted on giving him second authorship when he would have settled for an acknowledgement, which he had found embarrassing and then quietly meaningful. I'd known this time exactly how to use that. I went to his office with a very specific request and a lot of technical detail. What I needed was document provenance marking, the kind that was invisible to a casual reviewer but detectable in a forensic analysis of the underlying file structure. Every file I created in connection with the Caldwell methodology needed to carry, in its XML architecture, an embedded signature tied to my author ID. If those files were extracted from my Meridian account and resubmitted by another person, the signatures would persist in the resubmitted documents. Almost they could not be removed without destroying the file structure, which would produce its own forensic signature. Prosper listened to all of this with the particular attention of someone who is very good at his job hearing about a problem in his area. "This is achievable," he said. "I've done similar work for contract dispute documentation." "I know," I said. "That's why I came to you?" He thought for a moment. "You want the signatures keyed to your author ID specifically, not a generic timestamp?" "Both, but the author ID is the critical element, right?" He was already sketching something on the notepad beside his keyboard. "The signature can be embedded in the document's base metadata layer. It's invisible to any standard document reader. Detectable with a provenance analysis tool, the kind the ORI has access to." "I'm counting on that." He looked up. "Elise, what are you expecting to happen?" "I'm expecting someone to take these files and submit them as their own work," I said. "I want to be able to prove it when they do." He was quiet for 3 or 4 seconds. Then, "Do you want me to document the embedding process? Dates, methodology, records of which files received which signatures?" "Yes," I said. "Date and time, everything. Keep a copy on your personal server as well as the Institute's." He nodded. He picked up his pen and started writing. He didn't ask who. I appreciated that. The third structure, which I built over the following weeks in parallel with the first two, was the one that cost me the most in terms of sustained attention: the working record. This was not about traps or mechanisms. This was about producing the actual work in a way that left no ambiguity about its origin. Every file I created was versioned carefully, not just saved, but developed through the Institute's internal server in a sequence of drafts that showed the thinking underneath the methodology. Notes, revisions, dead ends identified and discarded. The intellectual trail. In research, there's a particular quality to an author's development that is difficult to fabricate because it includes mistakes. Real work, built over time, shows the wrong turns. Someone who has read the final version and memorized it cannot reproduce the draft history, and they cannot show the version where the statistical approach was incorrect, and then the version where it was corrected and the note to the file explaining why the correction was necessary. I made sure every wrong turn was in the record. Every revision, every question I'd had and couldn't answer until I'd gone back to the underlying data. By November, the working record for the Caldwell methodology would span 14 months of documented development in my Meridian file system, authenticated timestamps, embedded signatures, a draft history that read exactly like what it was. One person, building something carefully over a long time. The Thursday lunches with Arabella continued. They had a particular quality that I had not fully appreciated before, a kind of conversational craftsmanship. She was very good at drawing out information without appearing to seek it. She asked questions that sounded like engagement and functioned as data collection. She remembered what I said. She built on it in subsequent conversations, which created the pleasant feeling of continuity, of being truly listened to. I had loved this about her before. I had found it rare and valuable. Now I watched it with a different kind of attention and found it impressive in a way that required separating the skill from its purpose. I told her what I wanted her to know. Not everything. Not the new elements, not the second phase design, not anything that would still be in progress when she eventually looked. I talked about the parts that were complete, the parts that were already thoroughly documented, the parts that would be recognizable and attributable when examined closely. I let her see the methodology the way you let someone see a painting you know has your signature embedded in every layer of the canvas. In October, she brought Dorian into the conversations. Not directly. She mentioned him more frequently. A reference dropped into a sentence about a board meeting, a note that he had asked about the Caldwell timeline, a mutual observation about his interest in the project. She was testing the temperature of my response to his name, which was also what she'd done the first time. I responded with the same professional warmth I brought to everything and gave nothing away, because there was nothing to give. I already knew what he was. On it, the one change I made, the one that mattered in the long run, was that I started taking notes after each lunch. Not during. Nothing so overt. But within an hour of returning to the office, I would sit at my desk and write a summary of what we had discussed, what she had asked about, what I had told her, and when. Dated and timed. Stored in a personal file that was not on the Institute's system and could not be accessed through Meridian. It was the kind of record that doesn't become evidence, it becomes context. And context in an investigation is what gives evidence meaning. I had a conversation with Florian Ashby in the 4th floor kitchen in mid-October, which I've described, but I want to go back to it because there were things in it that I processed at the time but didn't fully understand until later. What he had told me about the board's pending approval of a direct filing channel for ORI complaints, meaning any credentialed researcher, not just department heads, could initiate a Clause 14C investigation. This had not existed in my first life. Florian himself had not been at Wyndham in my first life, or if he had, I had never encountered him. He had arrived somewhere in the period after I was gone. What I didn't understand until later was how that conversation had begun. He had not introduced himself. He had simply said, "I know. I've been reading your work." He had known who I was before I identified myself to him. He'd been reading the attribution methodology papers, 11 of them. He had read them in the course of reviewing the Institute's documentation culture. And the first thing he'd said about them, to me, ain't a woman he'd just met in a kitchen, was that they read like someone who treated attribution as a record rather than a formality. He had been, I realized later, already suspicious of the general documentation culture at Wyndham. He had come from an ethics committee. He had a 12-page memo on citation standards under his belt within a month of his appointment. He was, by professional instinct and personal disposition, someone who looked at the way institutions handled their own records and asked whether the handling was honest. He had looked at the Caldwell project in the course of his general review. He had looked at it before anything happened. I don't know what he saw. I don't know whether he was already watching Arabella or simply watching the state of the record in general. But I knew, after that kitchen conversation, that I had an ally in the ORI even before I filed anything. Not an ally in the sense of someone who was going to act for me, but an ally in the sense of someone who was already oriented in the right direction. The request came on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of October, as text rather than email. "Can I use your Meridian login for a few days? I'm pulling comparative data sets for the Pendleton review, and my access is still pending renewal. Oh, it'll be faster than going through a formal request." I sat with my phone for a moment and thought about the first time she'd sent me this message. I had replied in 30 seconds. "Sure, here it is." I hadn't thought about it again until the board meeting. I typed, "Of course. Come by whenever." She came that afternoon. She sat in the chair across from my desk and looked at me with the ease of someone who has been in this room many times and is comfortable in it. I wrote the credentials on a yellow sticky note, which I had photographed before she arrived, time-stamped to 4:43 p.m. I handed it to her. She took it, put it in her jacket pocket. Her eyes were warm and professionally grateful, and showed me nothing I hadn't known was there. "I'll let you know when I'm done," she said. "No rush," I said. "Take your time." She left. I waited until I heard the elevator open and close, and then the particular silence that meant she was not coming back immediately. Then I opened the monitoring dashboard Gideon had given me read-only access to, which showed my Meridian account activity in near real time, and I waited. At 4:47 p.m., my account was accessed from a machine with a different IP address. The machine identifier was registered to Arabella's Institute workstation. The session lasted 47 minutes. The files accessed included every layer of the Caldwell pharma methodology, the complete trial design architecture, the statistical framework, the data attribution model, the supporting data sets, and the full working draft history. She didn't read them. She bulk downloaded them. I watched the log generate entries in real time. I felt something that I have thought about since, trying to name correctly. It was not satisfaction. It was closer to the particular sensation of watching a proof confirm an answer you already knew. Not the surprise of discovery, but the verification of a hypothesis you've carried for a long time and needed to see proven on paper. And I closed the dashboard. The floor of the trap had held. The walls were in place. I still needed to wait. Waiting was, I will say, the hardest part. Not because I was anxious. I had already lived through the worst version of this story and knew that anxiety, in retrospect, was not a useful investment. But because I had the information to act immediately, and the discipline required to wait was a specific kind of expenditure. Every day that passed while Arabella worked for my downloaded files, every casual lunch conversation where she mentioned the Pendleton project, knowing full well she was using my methodology to anchor it, sat at every meeting I attended where Dorian asked questions about the Caldwell timeline with the practiced concern of someone who was managing a competitive situation. Each of these required me to hold the knowledge perfectly still, to keep it from leaking into my expression, or my tone, or the quality of my responses. I had always been good at stillness. I was better at it now. Arabella used my credentials 5 times in total. Each access logged, each session duration noted, each download flagged. The 5th access was the longest, 2 hours and 12 minutes, during which she pulled everything in my research correspondence folder going back 14 months. The notes, the memos, the internal working documents where I'd argued with myself on the page about which methodological approach was correct. She was learning to speak my thinking. Oh, that was the 5th access. She needed to be able to answer questions about the framework's origin and development, and the answers had to sound like they came from someone who had been inside it. They had to sound like her. She was thorough. She had always been thorough. November arrived with a specific quality of cold, the dry kind, without moisture, that settles into stone buildings and stays. The Institute held the cold differently than a residential building. There was something in the ventilation, in the consistent pressure of mechanically circulated air, that made the season's arrival feel institutional. Official. Arabella submitted the Caldwell Pharma methodology to the board on November 4th. I know the exact date because I saved the email notification. Which was sent to all senior researchers as a matter of course when a major proposal entered the fellowship review cycle. Her name was in the sender line. The project title was hers. The summary was 3 paragraphs in language I could have written with my eyes closed, which I knew because I had written it, in one form or another, in the working drafts she'd downloaded. I printed the email, added it to the file I'd been building since September, dated and initialed it, filed it behind the Gideon log printouts and in front of Prosper's signature documentation. The file was now 43 pages of evidence that was clean enough to hold up in a formal institutional review. I went to Margaret's office and told her I was taking an early lunch. She looked at me over her reading glasses with an expression I knew meant she was deciding whether to ask something. She decided not to. "Eat something real," she said. "You look like you've been subsisting on the 4th floor machine." "Mostly," I said, which was true. The board reviewed the Caldwell proposal on November 18th. I was not in the building for the review. I had arranged carefully and without drawing attention to have a genuine commitment that afternoon. A seminar at a neighboring research institution where I had been invited to present on cohort design. I left at noon. I presented at 3. I drove back through the early dark of a November evening and arrived back in the city at 6:30. At 7:14 p.m., Arabella texted me. They loved it. I read the text in the parking structure below the institute. Out with my engine still running, the heater circulating that particular dusty warmth of a car that has been driven a long distance. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment. Then I texted back. I heard it went well. Dinner to celebrate. Her reply came in under a minute. Tomorrow night. I set the phone down and looked through the windshield at the concrete pillar ahead of me. And I thought about what the next 4 weeks needed to look like. The board would formally review the fellowship award at a meeting in early December. The ORI complaint needed to be filed before that meeting. Specifically, in the window between Arabella's submission being positively received and the fellowship being formally awarded. If I waited until after the award, the revocation process would be longer and more contested. If I filed now, The ORI investigation would be running parallel to the board's review, and when the findings came back, they would reach the board before the fellowship was formally finalized. The timing was everything. It always was. I drove home. I made rice and vegetables, which I ate at my desk while reading through the complaint draft I'd been working on for 2 weeks. I made 3 edits and saved it. The dinner the following night was at a restaurant I will not name, because naming it would give it a permanence in this record it doesn't deserve. It was fine. The food was good. Arabella was warm and generous and precise in her gratitude in the way she always was, and she said something I'd been waiting for. "When I put this together," she said, setting down her glass, "I was drawing on everything we've talked about over the years." "Oh, you've influenced my thinking more than you know." There it was, an almost acknowledgement, a gesture toward credit that contained no accountability, no attribution, no record, designed to feel like generosity, designed to feel like a debt being symbolically honored without being legally recognized. I looked at her across the table and said, "Thank you for saying that," and meant nothing by it. She smiled. We ordered dessert. I filed the Clause 14C complaint on November 20th, not through HR, not through the research division, not through any channel that Dorian had oversight of or could be notified about in advance. Directly to Florian Ashby at the ORI through the direct filing mechanism the board had approved 3 weeks earlier, and that almost no one in the Institute knew existed yet. Oh, because Florian had updated the filing channel quietly, and the announcement had been in the compliance newsletter that most researchers deleted unread. I had not deleted it. The complaint was 11 pages and 5 appendices. Appendix A, Gideon Ferris's enhanced log report, 47 entries across 5 access sessions, machine identifier matched to Arabella's Institute workstation, timestamped against the development timeline of the submitted proposal. Appendix B, Prosper Oswin's provenance analysis of the submitted proposal documents, showing structural signatures in the XML architecture consistent with my author ID encoding. Dated documentation of the embedding process, signed and witnessed. Appendix C, the Wyndham Institute Research Integrity Policy. Full text, with Clause 14C highlighted. As the policy document was dated 2001 and had never been formally superseded. Appendix D, the photograph of the sticky note, timestamp 2:43 p.m., October 22nd, the credentials in my handwriting. Appendix E, my working draft history for the Caldwell methodology, 14 months of development records with institutional server timestamps, showing single-author development from inception through completion. The body of the complaint was factual throughout. I did not speculate about motive. I did not describe how I felt. I described what had happened, when it had happened, what the records showed, and what Clause 14C required the ORI to do with that information. The 5th section was 2 paragraphs. I stated that I was not requesting any specific outcome, that I was providing documentation for the ORI's independent review. That all materials had been retained with an independent third party. I signed it. I sent it. I stood up from my desk and went to the window. The courtyard in late November was bare and gray-brown, the trees stripped down to structure, the light flat and even at 4 in the afternoon. I looked at it for a few minutes without thinking about anything in particular, just looking. Then I went back to my desk and opened the Phase 2 design file. There was work to do. The ORI investigation opened on November 23rd. Florian's email was 5 lines, professionally worded, acknowledging receipt and noting that a Clause 14C investigation had been initiated. He did not ask for anything additional, he did not indicate what the timeline would be, or what steps the investigation would take. What happened in the following 6 weeks? I know from the findings report, and from one conversation I had with Florian much later, in a context where full professional discretion no longer entirely applied. The ORI pulled the Meridian access logs on day 1. This was straightforward. Gideon's enhanced logging had produced records so clean they required almost no interpretation. The originating machine, the session durations, the files accessed, the bulk downloads. 5 entries that painted a picture that could not be read any other way. They pulled the submission files on day 2, ran the provenance analysis. Prosper's structural signatures were present in every core document. The analysis software produced a report, which I didn't see until the formal findings, that identified the signatures and traced them back to my author ID with the precision of a document that has been very carefully made. They interviewed Arabella on day 4. I don't know what she said and made no effort to find out. What I know, from my understanding of her and of this specific situation, is that she had prepared thoroughly. She had memorized the framework. She could speak to it fluently, in depth, from multiple angles. She would have been convincing to most interviewers. Florian was not most interviewers. He had spent 20 years reading documents for provenance. He had a specific skill. The skill of someone who looks at a body of knowledge and listens for whether the person speaking it has an origin relationship to it or a learned relationship to it. Often the origin relationship has a texture that is difficult to describe, but immediately recognizable when you know what you're listening for. A learned knowledge has seams. The learning shows in the places where the fluency is slightly too even, slightly too rehearsed, not broken up by the particular hesitations that belong to someone who remembers inventing something. He would have heard the seams. When I asked him about it later, he did not say this directly. He said only, the attribution was clear from the documents. The interview confirmed it, which is the language of someone who knows how to stay inside the evidentiary record. Dorian found out on a Thursday in early December. He appeared in my doorway at 3 p.m, and his face had a quality I had never seen on it before. Not anger, too controlled for anger as itself. Like something more precisely calibrated. The expression of a person who has realized that a situation they believe to be managed has been operating on entirely different parameters than they understood. He sat down. He looked at me for a moment without speaking. I heard there's an ORI investigation, he said. Yes. Into the Caldwell submission. Yes. Elise. He paused. Why didn't you come to me first? I thought about the honest answer to that question, which was because you are not a resource for me in this situation, you are a counterparty. I thought about the diplomatic answer, which was that the ORI is the appropriate venue. I thought about the answer that was simply true. Because the ORI process exists for exactly this kind of situation, I said, and because it reports to the board, and not to the research division. He looked at me with a steadiness that I recognized as the particular stillness of a man absorbing information he cannot immediately do anything with. The board is going to want answers, he said. The ORI will provide them, I said. He stood there for perhaps 4 seconds, very still, as though he was running through possible responses and finding none of them adequate. Then he left. That was, as I have noted, essentially the last real conversation we had. I want to say something about the waiting period after the investigation opened, because I think the texture of that time is part of the record. I continued to work. Launch phase 2 of the Caldwell methodology was genuinely absorbing. A second phase design is more complex than the initial framework because you're working with the constraints established by the first phase and trying to extend them without losing the internal logic. I spent long afternoons in my office with the window open when the temperature allowed and a specific playlist I'd developed for concentrated work, building the second phase with the attention I had for the first time in 3 years to give entirely to the work without the low-level anxiety of a threat I couldn't see clearly. I had lunches with Arabella twice more before the ORI contacted her directly. They were strange lunches, stranger than all the lunches before. Maybe because now I knew what was running below the surface of her professional warmth, and she had no idea that I'd moved. She was managing a situation she believed was stable. I was watching her manage it. She mentioned the fellowship once, casually, with the particular modesty of someone who is prepared for a question that hasn't been asked. I said I was glad for her and asked about the Pendleton review, and she answered, and we talked about something else. The second to last lunch, she asked me how the Phase 2 design was coming. It's almost there, I said. You're fast, she said. You always have been. I've had a lot of time to think about it, I said. She looked at me for a moment. The testing look. Then she nodded and picked up her water glass, and the moment passed. The formal findings report was issued on January 12th. 47 pages. The executive summary was 4 paragraphs, which I will reproduce here as closely as I can from memory because they are the part of this record I return to most. The first paragraph stated that the ORI had completed its investigation under Clause 14C. The second paragraph stated that the investigation had determined, based on system access records, document provenance analysis, and corroborating evidence gathered in the investigation, that the submitted Caldwell Pharma methodology contained work developed by Dr. Elise Voss, accessed through the unauthorized use of Dr. Voss's institutional system credentials. The third paragraph stated that, in accordance with Clause 14C, the Category A research fellowship provisionally associated with the submission was immediately revoked, and the submitting researcher's credentials were placed under formal review pending a disciplinary proceeding. The fourth paragraph stated that the ORI found no evidence of wrongdoing on the part of Dr. Voss, and recommended that the Caldwell Pharma methodology be formally attributed to her, with appropriate institutional acknowledgement to be determined by the board. I read the report twice at my desk with a cup of coffee that went cold by the third page. Then I put the report down and looked at the courtyard, which was January bare, stripped to its structure, the gray sky sitting on it like a weight. I sat there for about 10 minutes, which was unusual for me. Margaret told me about Arabella's leave of absence that Thursday over tea, in the flat informational register she used for institutional news. She looked at me over her cup and didn't ask how I felt about it, because she had known me long enough to understand that asking me how I felt about something was less useful than providing the information and letting me do what I chose with it. "Do you want to talk about any of it?" she said. "No," I said. She tapped the table once and refilled her cup. Dorian's situation unfolded separately in the institutional language of a secondary finding. Section 6 of the report noted evidence of prior coordination between the submitting researcher and a member of senior research leadership, referred to the board for independent review. The board took 3 weeks. The announcement went out on a Tuesday morning. Dorian had made the decision to step down as director of clinical research to pursue other opportunities. Personal decision. As warmly worded, the specific fiction that institutions construct when the real version of events is too damaging to say in the open. I read the email in the fourth-floor kitchen while Florian was making coffee. He handed me a cup without being asked and said, "The board will be appointing an interim director." "I heard Margaret's name is being considered," I said. "It is." He paused. "She would be excellent." "She would," I said. I held the coffee cup and looked out the kitchen window at the courtyard, which by January had a specific kind of barren clarity to it. Everything stripped back to what it was, no foliage to soften any edge. "I read your complete archive," Florian said. "The attribution methodology papers, all 11. "I know there are 11, I said. "They're very good," he said. And the statement had the particular quality of something that had been considered carefully before being said, rather than offered as a conversational filler. I looked at him. He was looking at his coffee. "Thank you," I said. The Caldwell Pharma methodology was formally reattributed to my name on February 3rd. The Institute published a correction notice in the research registry and notified the pharmaceutical partnership. The Category A fellowship was offered to me directly. I sat with the offer for a week before I accepted, not from uncertainty, but from a desire to receive the offer as what it actually was. An accurate record. An accurate record of something I had built over a long time, with the specific quality of attention that comes from caring about what a thing is and not only what it produces. I signed the acceptance papers on a Tuesday, had them witnessed by Margaret because she was my department head and I liked the formal correctness of it, and because she had been, in her particular understated way, a witness to the whole of it. She co-signed, handed the papers back. "You'll need a larger office eventually," she said. "Eventually," I said. "Now eat something," she said. "You've been running on the fourth-floor machine for months." 2 months, I said. "Food," she said. There was a day in late February, a Tuesday, mid-afternoon, one of those days where the light comes in at a low angle and makes everything briefly look less institutional than it is. When I was in my office going through a draft of the second phase design, and there was a knock at the door. Signed to first-year researcher from the Computational Methods Division named Hadley stood in the doorway. She had been at the ORI symposium I was scheduled to speak at in late March, and I remembered her face from the back row. She asked if I had 20 minutes. I had 40, actually, but I said yes. She sat down and told me what she'd noticed. Someone in her division was pulling from her modeling work in ways she couldn't fully document, but could feel in the structure of what was being produced. She didn't have proof. She wasn't sure whether what she had constituted a concern or a paranoia. She'd been going back and forth about it for 2 weeks. I listened to all of it. Then I said the things I've described. Start logging today, learn Clause 14C, don't change how you work. And then she asked the question that stayed with me. How does it work? I thought about the hospital room with the water-stained ceiling tile, the 14 months of Meridian logs, the sticky note photograph, the 47-page report, the formal attribution sitting in the Institute's research registry under my name. Yes, I said, it works, but it only works if you build it before you need it, not after. She wrote that down. She thanked me and left, and I turned back to my window. The courtyard in February was the particular color of a world preparing to change, still bare, still gray at its edges, but with something in the quality of the light that said the change was coming. I opened the Phase 2 file. There was work to do. I want to be precise about the mechanism, because it is the part of this that matters beyond the specific events. Well, what Clause 14C did was remove the investigation from the chain of command. In a normal institutional review, a complaint about research fraud would pass through the research division, which meant through Dorian, who had been the one building the runway for Arabella's submission. In a normal institutional review, there would have been notification, opportunity for response, the specific political management that an experienced director could perform under the cover of due process. Clause 14C bypassed all of it. It created a direct line between the complainant and the ORI, and from the ORI to the board, without ever passing through the research division's territory. The clause existed because of a plagiarism scandal in 2001 that I had never heard of before I read the full institutional policy document in Gideon's office. As it had been written specifically to address a situation where a junior researcher's work had been taken by someone who also controlled the institutional complaint process. The committee that wrote it had understood the architecture of that particular problem precisely, that the person most likely to commit credential fraud was also likely to be in a position to manage the investigation of that fraud. They had built a mechanism to address that. They had buried it in a policy document that no one had needed to use in 22 years. I found it because I read the whole thing. That is, if there is a lesson in any of this, the lesson, not the specific mechanism. Clause 14C belongs to Wyndham Institute in 2001 and may not exist in the institution that is relevant to whoever is reading this. The lesson is the whole thing, the whole document. The procedural architecture that most people skip because it appears to concern situations they don't expect to be in. Read the whole thing. Know the exits before you need them. The March symposium was in the large conference space in the North Wing. 60 researchers, maybe slightly more. I spoke for 40 minutes on attribution practice, on the concrete mechanics of building a record that protects work regardless of what happens to the working relationship around it. Not abstractly, specifically, timestamps and metadata, and the specific clauses in institutional policy and the particular skills of the people in your building who know how to document provenance. I did not reference what had happened to me. There was no need. Florian was in the back of the room, standing. I noticed immediately, and noted it in the register of things I was tracking without directly watching. There was a question period. The young researcher from the Pendleton Review asked about building a record when you don't have reason to suspect anything yet. When it still seems excessive, I said that the record is not for when you suspect. The record is for always. The record is your relationship to your own work. Building it is not a defensive act. It's an accurate act. She wrote that down. Afterward, Florian and I had dinner. I have described this already, but I want to return to one specific moment. He said, "You knew what was going to happen." And I said, "I had a strong hypothesis." And he looked at me for a moment and said, "It's a long time to know something and wait. I have thought about that sentence many times since. There is something in it that understands not only the strategy, but the cost of the strategy. The specific expenditure of keeping very still in the presence of something that is happening to you, because moving prematurely would collapse the mechanism you've built." He didn't push it further. which was, as I said, the exact right thing. What he understood, I think, what he had probably understood from the moment he received the 11-page complaint with the 5 appendices and the full clause 14C citation, was that the complaint had been built over months, not written in a day of grief, that the person who filed it had been carrying the knowledge of what was coming and had built around it rather than against it. He was, in his way, a person who understood long patience. The ORI is not a fast instrument. It rewards people who have built things that will hold up under time and scrutiny, not people who act from immediate feeling. We had spoken the same language from the beginning. I had just needed to find that out. In April, Margaret was confirmed as interim director of clinical research. She sent a one-line email to the faculty, no exclamation points, no rhetorical warmth, just the statement, and that she looked forward to the work. I kept it in the same file as the ORI report. The Category A Fellowship for the Caldwell methodology was formally activated on April 7th. I had a larger research budget, pharmaceutical partnership access, and the institutional authority to develop Phase 2 with a full team if I chose. I chose a small team, 3 researchers who were good at their specific things and who asked the right questions. Ewout Hadley from Computational Methods was one of them, which was a decision I made without fully articulating to myself why, and then articulated later. She was someone who understood now how to protect her work. I wanted that around me. The work was good, the kind of good that comes from a foundation that was built right. There was an afternoon in May, windows open for the first time, the particular smell of warm stone and something green coming from the courtyard. I was at my desk going through Phase 2 cohort projections when I thought, without particularly meaning to, about the version of this timeline where none of what I'd done had worked, where the logging had somehow not captured what I needed, where Prosper's signatures had been detectable and stripped, where the ORI had not had a direct filing mechanism. There had been many places where it could have failed. I had been in the hospital with a notepad writing timelines and contingencies, and the particular clarity of someone who has already lost and is not inclined to lose again. And I had built something that could survive being tested from multiple angles. Not because I was infallible, because I understood the landscape. Understanding the landscape is most of it, in the end. I was in the elevator one morning in late May when Arabella stepped in on the 2nd floor. We rode up together. She looked at the floor numbers as they changed. Her posture was careful in the specific way of someone who has practiced being in a room with a person they have wronged and is managing the mechanics of it. When the doors opened at her floor, she stepped out and then turned. I would have acknowledged you," she said. Eventually, the doors were already beginning to close. "I know," I said. "I don't know if it's true. Probably it isn't." The acknowledgement, if it ever came, would have been the same gesture as the dinner. The almost acknowledgement, the debt paid symbolically in private, while the record remained public in her name. But it didn't matter. That part of the accounting was never mine to do. Mine was the record. The record was done. On a Monday in early June, I opened my Meridian account for the first time since the investigation concluded with no purpose related to any of the preceding events. I opened it because I had a question about Phase 2 cohort structuring, and I wanted to look at the underlying data. The login screen asked for my credentials. I typed them. I did the 2-second pause of server authentication, the low hum. Then the database opened. My files were where I'd left them. Every layer, every draft, every timestamp, every embedded signature, the complete architecture of 3 years of work, documented from its earliest iteration to its most recent. The record, entire and mine. I opened the Phase 2 design file and started to work.